1971, the government produced briefing paper 1048, which showed Britain being deceitfully bundled into a federal states of Europe. It was suppressed for 30 years. This channel brings you the truth.
Welcome to the third edition of Eurocon. This week we're looking at what appears to be yet another misleading campaign by British politicians being economical with the truth. On the 1st of January 1973, the UK became part of the European Economic Community, or the Common Market as it was then known. At the time, most thought we were joining a trading arrangement with our European partners. What wasn't public knowledge was the fact that the UK had been secretly signed up to becoming part of a federal superstate, now known as the European Union. Amongst other changes, Britain also found itself part of a European trading bloc entitled the Single Market. Probably because of the current Eurozone crisis and the fact that the British people are waking up to the realisation that they have been hoodwinked over membership of a federal Europe, support for EU membership is dwindling fast. In an attempt to counter growing calls for Britain to leave the EU, British politicians are warning against doing anything that might damage the single market. Are they right to do so? Or, as is so often the case, is this just more political chicanery? Linda has been looking at the single market and its possible significance to Britain.
The EU single market is a trade bloc allowing free movement of capital, labour, goods and services. The 27 EU nations within the single market agree on common policies for product regulation, some relaxation of borders and universally accepted technical standards. In addition, the single market operates as a customs union, imposing external tariffs on those who trade with the EU from outside the single market. We're being told that British membership of the single market is vitally important for the well-being of our country. But in the absence of a properly conducted cost-benefit analysis, how do we know this to be true? And what about the increasing erosion of British sovereignty? Is that just to be allowed to continue? Do alternatives to membership of the single market exist? In short, are we being given a true evaluation of the significance of the single market and its relevance to us? In his recent book, Time to Say No, Ian Milne looked at the prospect of life outside the single market. We featured his thoughts in our video, Leaving the European Union. Here's a clip from that film.
Switzerland, surrounded on all sides by the EU, has, with the approval of the Swiss electorate through referenda, set up a series of industry-by-industry free trade agreements with the EU. Switzerland retains full sovereign control over areas covered in the Swiss-EU free trade areas, each side retaining its veto. With one exception, in civil aviation, none of the bilateral free trade agreements obliges Switzerland to adopt the relevant part of the acquis communautaire, the massive EU book of rules. This is a model Britain could easily copy. Switzerland, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein are members of the 50-year-old European Free Trade Association, EFTA, of which Britain was a founder member before joining the EU. Unlike the EU, EFTA is not a customs union in which members surrender control to the centre. Each EFTA member conducts its own trade policies and sits and votes at the World Trade Organization in its own right. 3 of the 4 EFTA states, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, are members with the EU 27 of the 30-member European Economic Area, but remain outside the Common Agriculture Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, EU Foreign and Defence Policies, EU Justice and Home Affairs Policies, EU Monetary Union, and any other policy not specifically provided for in the EEA Treaty. A radical option for the UK would be to withdraw from the EU completely and, under the World Trade Organization umbrella, to unilaterally declare genuine free trade with the countries of the world, including the remaining EU. Following such withdrawal, the UK ought to consider making the Commonwealth the main focus and vector of its global trade policy. In 2050, for example, viewed from the UK, the Commonwealth will constitute a market 9 times greater than that of continental EU. By a fortunate accident of history, the Commonwealth will be where much of global GDP and trade growth will occur over the next half-century.
That video can be seen in full on this website, but as you can already see from this clip, there are real and viable alternatives to membership of the EU single market. Membership of the European Union means full trade access for Britain to the other 26 EU countries within the single market. But as shown in the film, membership of the single market is not solely concerned with trade. At present, it also involves compliance with and financial contributions to the Common Agricultural Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, regional funding initiatives, as well as the acceptance of the imposition of social and employment regulations, interference from the European Court of Justice, ever-increasing contributions to the EU budget, and last but not least, the continuing loss of democratic, accountable governance at Westminster, with the inexorable transfer of power to the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. The acid test is whether the alleged benefits of the UK being in the single market compensate for the political and economic costs to the UK. The simple answer is that the British people are not being supplied with sufficient information to judge. Over the past 40 years, all 3 major British political parties have refused to carry out and publish a cost-benefit analysis of EU membership. Why is that too much to ask? What is it that they're afraid such a cost-benefit analysis might reveal? So, yet again, the British people are being bombarded with economic arguments against withdrawal from the European Union, but without being given any hard facts to substantiate those arguments. But we've been here before with political predictions many times. John Major, for example, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, uttered these words, urging Britain to join the exchange rate mechanism in the early 1990s.
For us, the ERM stands for stability, for effective, reliable management. It stands for low inflation, for an end to ruining money.
Within less than 2 years, Britain was forced to quit the ERM to avoid national bankruptcy. Similarly, when the euro was introduced on the 1st of January 2002, most politicians and broadcasters urged Britain to join. Few, if any, would suggest such a course of action now. And in the early 1970s, we were told we were joining just a trading arrangement with Europe, when in fact it was nothing of the sort. These pamphlets, this one issued prior to Britain joining, and this one for the 1975 referendum, are full of promising predictions about trade, but are deceitfully short on detail concerning constitutional change. Almost always when situations have arisen questioning the UK's membership of the EU, the British people have been fobbed off with statements about membership being vital for trade and for the economy. There is never any mention of the constitutional and political price we have to pay. The truth is that the single market, like the single currency, is an essential structure in the creation of the European federal state. Without the single market, there is no European project, and that's a fact. What is also a fact is that the countries of the European Union sell more to us than we sell to them. We have been almost permanently running a trading loss with the EU for the past 40 years. Given this trading imbalance in their favour, EU countries would undoubtedly continue to trade with us were we to leave the EU and the single market. After all, business is business. Perhaps most important is the following recent development. Independent Labour peer Lord Stoddart of Swindon recently submitted a written question to ministers about trade negotiations between the EU on the one hand and Japan, Canada, Singapore and Morocco on the other. He asked if these countries would have to adopt the laws and regulations that govern the single market before they would be allowed to sell their goods. Trade Minister Lord Green responded as follows.
It is not the case that as a result of these trade negotiations, the countries concerned will have to adopt all the legislation and regulations that apply to EU member states.
Duties levied on the goods exported by these countries are to be all but scrapped, and they will be expected only to uphold generally agreed international standards rather than EU regulations. As Lord Stoddart commented,
"The genie is out of the bottle here. For decades, the apologists for EU membership have parroted the tired argument that Britain must be a member because it would otherwise have to accept all the legislation and regulations from Brussels without having a say in how they are developed. This answer to my written question, once and for all, blows that argument right out of the water."
There is very little hard evidence from our political masters that in order to trade with the countries of the single market, the UK needs to be in the single market. Such evidence that we do have tends to indicate that were the UK to leave the European Union, and with it membership of the single market, it would continue to trade with those countries of the EU in much the same manner as the rest of the world does now, with the proviso that the UK is prepared to submit goods of a quality that is prescribed by the single market and to pay the tax imposed by the single market. The Stoddart letter confirms this arrangement. The real prize, however, would be that the British people would regain the ability to govern themselves. UK laws would be enacted through our duly elected and publicly accountable members of Parliament, sitting in Westminster. No longer would the UK have laws imposed upon it by decree from unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels.
Thank you, Linda. David Cameron and some of his ministers have already made it quite clear that the survival of the single market will be one of the arguments they will employ to justify continued British membership of the EU. As we've seen, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, that is a complete red herring. So, yet another myth is being promoted by yet another British Prime Minister. Since Edward Heath piloted the UK into the EU in 1973, successive Prime Ministers, Wilson, Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, and now Cameron with his deputy Clegg, have all deliberately chosen not to share with the British people the complete picture of the UK's membership of the EU. They've all talked up the alleged benefits, but never explained the cost. So what is our conclusion? Sooner or later there will be a referendum in the UK on whether or not the UK should remain in the EU. Before that referendum is held, the government should provide the British people with a cost-benefit analysis of our membership of the EU. Without that analysis, without that information, how can we make an informed decision? This is far from being the end of this particular story. Here at the unit, we will continue to monitor developments and bring them to you as they happen. See you soon.
Eurocon has been produced by the unit. You can find our website at theunit.com. Our website also contains nightly filmed bulletins highlighting the most recent European Union developments affecting Britain. The next Eurocon programme will include an examination of another important area in the governance of Britain by the European Union. Remember, should anything further develop which you ought to know about, we will do our best to bring it to you without delay on this channel.